Thanks, Matt, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening. I'm super excited about this online roundtable on rereading the Minerva Press. This is connected to my own ongoing work on a monograph called Irish Gothic in the Global 19th Century, which focuses on Minerva Press novels by Irish writers. And this idea actually grew out of a conversation with Matt Sangster about wouldn't it be fun to get people together to talk about their favorite Minerva novels and also why we should be reading them? Because, of course, we're not really reading that many Minerva novels these days. They're not that accessible. And it would be fantastic to just think about actually these novels as having value and being worth reading. So that's what we're going to try to do tonight. I'm going to keep it fairly informal. I'm going to introduce each of our contributors in turn and just in alphabetical order. They're going to talk for about 5 or 10 minutes each about their favorite Minerva novels, or one of their favorite Minerva novels anyway. And we'll go through all of the contributors and then we'll throw it open to the floor for questions and comments and general discussion. If you have a question or a comment, please pop it into the chat box and I'll read them out after everyone's finished. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and I hope we're all going to leave here fired up about Minerva Press novels and wanting to go read more of them. So, our first speaker tonight is Beth Brigham, who is a research fellow in English at Northumbria University. Her research seeks to define the medico-Gothic as a distinct genre of the Gothic, mediated by a body of medical and Gothic writers through the popular literary formats of the period from 1790 to 1850. Her primary research aim is to reassess the cultural significance of ephemeral, anonymously or female authored Gothic texts and to recover marginalised narratives. And she's published research on Mrs. Carver's The Horrors of Oakendale Abbey, the Minerva Press novel from 1797, and I believe that's what she'll be talking to us about tonight. So Beth, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to say, firstly, I'm really delighted to be speaking at this event today, particularly alongside scholars that I'm really indebted to for that development of my own research. So thank you, Christina, for that invitation. Unsurprisingly, yes, the text I want to discuss today is Mrs. Carver's The Horrors of Oakendale Abbey, a Gothic novel published by the Minerva Press in 1797, which really came to my attention while I was doing my PhD. So having published on this, I've spoke about this novel for many years. So I'm really sorry if people are really sick of me kind of harping on about this one novel. But there are many reasons why I place so much focus on this particular novel. So this novel really is the reason why Minerva Press first captured my attention, and so it prompted my subsequent pursuit of understanding publishing history more broadly. My interest in material aspects of the book fell in line with a long-standing passion for women's writing and marginalised texts as well. So in thinking about all the ways during the PhD that this particular novel had been overlooked and aspects of the novel that deserved more attention, I felt that this novel really took me down many research rabbit holes that actually form the foundation of the thesis. So it's been really integral to my way of thinking, really. Um, so really the focus of me talking tonight is not necessarily to explain that research that I produced around it, but rather to highlight this novel as what I think is a notable example of all the reasons why we as scholars should be taking Minerva Press literature into account. And that's whether our interests really lie in romantic studies, studies of the Gothic, which is where my interest came in, publishing and book history, women's studies, the list goes on. So at first glance, Mrs. Carver's The Horrors of Oakendale Abbey appears to hold all the conventions of typical Radcliffean Gothic romance from the late 18th century, and also similar identifying features of Gothic texts so infamously produced by the Minerva Press. The novel revolves around a traditional orphaned heroine, Laura, imprisoned in Oakendale Abbey by the aristocratic villain Lord Oakendale, who hopes to scare her into marrying him. The rumours surround the Abbey of ghosts and other supernatural occurrences, again, typical of what we might expect. But what's more unique to this novel is the succession of dead bodies, walking corpses, and skeletons, which are ultimately linked to be with a body snatching gang working out of the Abbey. The Abbey is being used as potentially a dissecting theatre where body snatchers deliver bodies stolen from graves, and the possibility that these subjects could have even been murdered for the purposes of providing bodies for medical study, which really adds this element of medical Gothic horror to the novel that has become significant for me. So my research has developed around this idea that the medical Gothic is an understudied subgenre of the Gothic. The term really kind of remains without concrete definition, and there are a few specific studies using this term. Medical Gothic, though in its simplest form, is a body of text with clear medical or scientific focus, produced as a consequence of that close relationship between medical practitioners and literary figures, and that kind of entanglement of medical reality and Gothic fiction. Most timelines would leave us to believe that the medical Gothic really began with something like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and then picks up again with the clinical tales of the Victorian period, kind of leaving us with these really glaring and obvious gaps in between. So again, the Minerva Press becomes important because part of the reason I think so few texts have been identified under this heading of the medical Gothic specifically, and that the late 18th century maybe hasn't been considered when thinking about something like this, is that the fiction produced by the Minerva Press it remains relatively unknown and many novels remain obscure. So behind just beyond just being what I think is a hugely entertaining novel, The Horrors of Oakendale Abbey actually exemplifies how significant individual studies of the Minerva novel can be. In this case, holding the potential to expand fields of literary study, such as the medical Gothic. So one particular scene for me, which is important, is where Laura attempts to escape from the Abbey and she stumbles into this lair of the body snatchers. As she does so, she's confronted by an almost zombie-like walking corpse, described as having a face that was almost black, the eyes that seemed starting from the head, the mouth was widely extended, and made a kind of hollow, guttural sound in attempting to articulate. So we later discover that this strange figure of the undead is a criminal taken from the gallows who seemingly revived only to be faced with the prospect of ending up on a dissecting table. So the novel holds these familiar concepts of a corpse being brought back to life, so familiar within Frankenstein. And Laura's description of that discoloured face, the bulging eyes, inarticulate sounds, they're all elements of similar to Shelley's creation. This scene then is just one of many that highlights the horrors of Oakendale Abbey as a recognisably medical Gothic novel, but it also vastly precedes the publication of Shelley's text. So, despite ample reason to look to the Minerva Press as highly influential to literary culture, to reading trends of the period, a large contributing factor for the reason that Carver's novel, or as with other Minerva novels, has received little attention is that anonymous status of the author. While published under the name Mrs. Carver, nothing's known about the author really in concrete, beyond the attribution of that pseudonym to four novels. So Elizabeth of 1797, Horrors of the same year, The Legacy of 1798, and The Old Woman from 1800. So Mrs. Carver then does present us with a mystery. Originally, these novels were published anonymously, with Dorothy Blakey noting that Minerva Catalogue of 1814 first attributed the name Carver to these four texts, with one of William Lane's well-known marketing practices being to falsely attribute texts to certain authors as a way to bump sales. These four texts could well be the work of four different authors. Though at the time of publication, Horrors appeared with the claim of being by the author of Elizabeth, and The Old Woman held the claim of being written by the author of Horrors. So indeed, without this clearly identifiable author, Minerva novels have tended to be viewed as a homogenous mass of fiction, informing judgments of the texts themselves and the assumption that these authors, typically women, choose to remain in obscurity because their texts hold less value than those authors, typically men, who choose to put their names on the title page, in turn shaping judgments that have led Minerva Press fiction to receive little scholarly attention. This novel then has recently been lost amongst that kind of sheer number of novels produced by the Minerva Press in its heyday. The large number of novels published in this period perhaps serving as that barrier to scholarly and general interest, maybe. You know, we raise questions of how do we approach such an overwhelming amount of literature? How do we gain some kind of comprehensive knowledge of what was produced in this period? However, the scholarship surrounding the Minerva Press, pioneered by my fellow panelists, really has shown the importance of alternate value systems, where reading a text of one as many is found to be both the source of Minerva's unique innovation and that point through which we can uncover a text's individual innovation without really even knowing the identity of the author. So the way in which Carver's novel applies but also manipulates the conventions of the Minerva Gothic, for example, explaining the supernatural, yet replacing it with the more horrifying reality of a body snatcher, only serves to highlight that distinctive medical horror. And then finally, just to really shift to a slightly different angle, I think during a previous Minerva Press workshop, a point that was raised was around this clear value that comes from a consideration of Minerva Press scholarship when viewed from both sides of the Atlantic. So, taking into account that American publishers reprinted more Minerva novels than any other single British or European publisher in the early 19th century, I think placing this focus on a transatlantic importation of such texts, how they came to America, who was importing them, and why certain texts were chosen, is one way that I would pursue a point that I overall want to make, really, which is that reading a novel like Mrs. Carver's The Horrors of Oakendale Abbey has that potential to open up many new avenues of thought, whether in terms of Minerva Press specific scholarship, studies of a Gothic subgenre, history of publishing in the UK and on a global scale. And I'm raising this point as well because The Horrors of Oakendale Abbey has such a unique publication history. It serves to be more than a quickly consumed flash in the pan. The novel was published in serial form in the Philadelphia periodical The Desert of the True American in 1798. It was again printed as a single volume in 1799 by John Harrison of New York. Further new edition was printed in Pennsylvania as late as 1812. So, in fact, the only surviving 1797 edition of the novel that I found during my research is actually held at special collections in the University of Pennsylvania. So this is interesting for me as the University of Pennsylvania is a notable site of medical training and anatomical teaching in the 19th century and today. Again, raising questions around how and why this particular novel was reprinted here so often, and whether this particular interest was fueled by its medical Gothic content. And it does make this novel stand out amongst the other texts attributed to Carver as well. So even the physical makeup of the text as a concise narrative presented in one volume, where many novels ran across two or three substantial volumes, I think suggests horror was intended to be consumed in its entirety for reasons maybe beyond simple entertainment. And so to conclude all of these little strains of thought that I've had here, I think really Elizabeth and Christina actually best summarize this, the reasons why we should be reading novels like Carver's Horrors when they state that the analysis of the cultural afterlives of Minerva Press novels via circulation evidence, reprint and translation history, and its continued literary references actually indicates really the tenaciousness of Lane's Press and its productions. And I hope also I've inspired you and you're not sick of hearing about the horrors of Oakendale Abbey from me. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. I mean, that has just gotten us to off to a fantastic start. I think you've raised so many of the central issues that come up with question, when we think about reading Minerva. So thank you so much for that, Beth. And we'll have time at the end to come back to questions. And just remember, for those of you who are attending, if you have questions, just pop them into the chat, and I will go through them all when all of the panelists have finished. So next we're over to Bridget Donnelly, who is an assistant professor of English at Middle Tennessee State University. Her primary teaching and research interests include 18th century British literature and Gothic and horror literature. Her recent and forthcoming publications include essays on British literature pedagogy and reading Taylor Swift alongside 18th century women writers like Eliza Haywood and Frances Burney. She co-edited a critical edition of Elizabeth Meek's The Abbey of Clugny, and that's how I always say it in my head. And I realize now that I'm saying it that I've never actually heard somebody say it out loud. So please correct me if I didn't get that right. With a team of undergraduate and graduate student researchers. And the edition is slated to appear in May with Routledge's Charlton House women's novel series. So I'm dying to hear more about this, particularly with the graduate and undergraduate students being involved. So over to you, Bridget.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so that is the novel I'm going to be talking about today. I also have always said Clooney, so who knows? Um, but yeah, so I co-edited this novel in a class I taught in the fall semester of 2023, I believe. It was a course about the history of the Gothic. And we spent most of the semester thinking about the Minerva Press, learning about it, and then doing research on this author, Elizabeth Meeke, and this particular novel. So it was a really fun and challenging endeavor. But I had my students as their course project develop this critical edition, or at least the very early draft of it. And so, yeah, over the course of the semester, they annotated the text, produced footnotes, did as much research as they possibly could, and then collaboratively wrote an introduction to the novel. And that was kind of like the early bones of what ended up in our edition that is coming out soon. So that is super exciting. Um, so I really discovered Meek while like very accidentally. I have been very slowly working on what hopefully post tenure will be a book project on um, ghost related carriage accidents in Gothic novels. And so I stumbled upon a novel by this author, Gabrielli. And I was like, this is a strange name. And so I started digging, and this kind of led me down the rabbit hole of learning about Meek, learning about, I'm not going to go into the whole thing now, but Simon McDonald's article that came out, I believe, in 2013, convincingly showing that this mysterious author, Meek, Mrs. Meek, Gabrielli, was in fact Elizabeth Meek, the stepsister of Frances Burney, and the most prolific novelist of the late 18th and early 19th century. So I've been really fascinated with her ever since, and kind of chose this novel really for practical reasons. It is one of her shortest novels. It's only her second novel. So just for practical concerns of doing it in a semester, that's kind of why I chose it. But it turned out to be a really fascinating one because of the way that it really reveals so much about the Minerva's intersection between, literary production, genre, women's writing, the demands of the publishing industry, all of these things that we all know and maybe love about the Minerva. Um, so let's see. Yeah, Meek is mostly known among scholars today, primarily for a preface to her 1802 novel Midnight Weddings, where she really explicitly addresses this question of the relationship between author and publisher. So this quote might sound familiar to some of you, but she writes, she, meaning the author, must, which, as being a more competent judge than herself of the prevalent taste she ought to do, consult with her publisher. Indeed, to secure their approbation is rather the general aim. For should you fail of meeting with a purchaser, that labor you hope will immortalize you is absolutely lost, a most mortifying circumstance in every sense of the word. And the gentlemen or ladies who sit in judgment upon the fine spun webs from the prolific brains of female authors are very competent to decide upon the taste of the public. So, as probably many of us know, many Minerva authors, but Meek, I think in particular, really reveal themselves to be these savvy negotiators between the reading public and the demands of the literary marketplace. I found it really, really helpful and productive. I think I was it last year at ASEX talked about this in a roundtable about for my students, we linked the Minerva to a lot of popular trends in contemporary publishing, specifically the digital subscription service of Kindle Unlimited, right? Thinking about the ways that this subscription service that includes both traditionally published novels and, you know, very bad self-published fiction is really kind of like iterating on these common trends of the publishing industry. And my students really latched onto that. So that was, I think, a really productive way of introducing this author and this text in particular to them. And so the Abbey of Clugny itself is definitely very clearly responding to these contemporary trends in Gothic fiction. Um, Mysteries of Udolpho appeared just a year before the Abbey of Clugny, and you can definitely see Meeke directly referencing aspects of Udolpho in this novel. She uses so many of these common tropes and narrative devices, the explained supernatural, picturesque landscapes, possibly haunted abbeys, delayed revelations of noble birth, misattributions of identity, pseudo-incest that is then revealed later on to be not an actually incestuous relationship, and critiques of cloistered nuns. All of these you see throughout the novel. Um, and so it's very clear, right? She knows what her readers want to see. Um, there was a review of this novel from the Monthly Review that MacDonald has convincingly pointed out was probably written by Charles Burney Jr. And in that he writes, "Ghosts are in the fashion. And as we were entertained by the specter, we cannot blame the fair writer for following the mode." Right. So definitely seeing these uses of conventions. So I mentioned the misattributions of identity. The novel centers around a young man who has I don't even know how many aliases over the course of the novel. We had this running Google Doc with my class where we were just like listing all of the different identities that all the characters had. But he is alternately known as Alexis de Weilberg, the Marquis de Saint-Cernin, and Alfonso. And as an infant, he was mysteriously delivered into the care of the Baron Weilberg. On the eve of marriage to his adopted sister, the Baron's niece Alphonsine, Alexis's supposed father, the Duc de Longueville, discovers he's still living and brings him back to Paris. So again, over the course of the novel, his true parentage is revealed through a series of coincidental encounters, very 18th century. Um, in the intervening sections of the narrative, Alexis and his companions visit the Abbey of Clugny, which is supposedly haunted by the ghost of his recently deceased and very villainous abbess. The ghosts in the novel, hilariously, they're almost immediately revealed to not be real. It is so fascinating to me because it really feels like a deep discomfort with the idea of the supernatural ever being real, right? So, if you read Radcliffe and then you read Meeke, you're probably going to be a little bit disappointed. But I think it's really fascinating to see just the way that she has these kinds of attempts to follow the mode, but then this intense discomfort with the supernatural. She doesn't allow her reader to ever sit in suspense. The narrator's attitude toward religion also are very ambivalent and complex throughout the text. There is one character, this very silly priest named Father Onufrius, who at one moment is determined to quell the growing suspicion that the abbey is haunted, and so stays up all night with his fellow priests, but they just get very drunk. Um, and so then, of course, he sees the ghost, which we later learn, or almost immediately learn, is in fact Alexis himself. And this continues throughout the rest of the novel, where he is pulling all these various pranks in the guise of the ghost on Father Onufrius, to kind of laugh at this priest's hypocrisy. Um, it's very funny at times. Although my students were definitely a little bored sometimes, she has a sense of humor, and these kinds of scenes really emphasize that. Um, I think it's also a very productive novel to think about in relation to Burney's writing. Um, it has uh, very similar kinds of critiques of French foppery that we see in a text like Evelina. Um, and it is a novel that's really interestingly invested in French history, culture, and politics. It uses them very messily. Um, it's clear that she's very invested in some places in very realistically representing French geography, roadways, things like that. And then in other places, she's really playing with it and getting details wrong, and you're not sure if that's intentional or unintentional. Her grasp of French language is not the best. We spent a lot of time looking at that when editing the novel. Um, but the novel is set in 1770. So you have this interesting kind of tension in the novel where it's clear that some of her, um, commentary on the pending revolutionary um, things that are happening, the social, economic, political, religious upheaval is there, but it's ambivalent. So it's very interesting. Like Radcliffe, she's very, very critical of the social pressure put on young women to take the veil, go into convents. This happens to the character of Alphonsine, and very reminiscent of Romance of the Forest, Udolpho, other Radcliffe novels. So, yeah, ultimately, I think that Meeke is a really fascinating novelist because of how prolific she was, but I also think that she's really productive to read in relation to Burney, especially. I didn't go into Meek's biography, but I think that there is definitely uh, a a potential that Burney included some of Meek's biography in some of her novels. And it also, this novel and Meek's novels in general really do show the kind of influence of these trends in literary publishing in a way that I think is really fascinating. So definitely, I'd recommend reading this one. It's one of her shorter novels. So, if you want an accessible place to start with Meek, I would recommend The Abbey of Clugny.
Thanks so much, Bridget. I mean, I'm really looking forward to your edition. I mean, I love that you're teaching this. I would love to get my students reading Roach's The Children of the Abbey, but it's just felt like a little bit too much to ask them, particularly because there's no edition available. We have to use 18th century collections online or whatever. Although I suppose there have been a few a couple of recent editions. But anyway, I love that you're teaching it. So thank you so much for telling us about that. Our next speaker is Hannah Doherty Hudson, who is Associate Professor of English at Suffolk University in Boston. Her interests include romantic era fiction, intertextuality, periodical culture, the affordances of biography, and the commercial history of print. Her monograph, which I highly recommend everybody read, Romantic Fiction and Literary Excess in the Minerva Press Era, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. She's currently working on a new book tentatively called Romantic Magazines and Imperial Knowledge, Commodity, Identity, Miscellany, which examines the role of the miscellaneous magazine in developing new models of imperial collection and knowledge formation in the years around 1800. And today she's talking to us about Count Roderick's Castle. So over to you, Hannah.
Thanks so much, Tina. So I will begin by saying, when asked to choose my favorite Minerva Press novel, I found this to be a very difficult challenge. So I have to begin with a disclaimer that there are many different novels I considered. There's so many Minerva novels. They're all so different, and I like and dislike them for all different reasons. But the one that I decided to talk about today, as Tina said, is called Count Roderick's Castle. And for the reasons that I'm about to describe, I do think that this book deserves more attention than it has usually gotten, and it's definitely a book that I think should be on the radar of folks who are studying the Gothic or studying the Minerva Press. So, Count Roderick's Castle, as that castle title probably suggests, is a Gothic novel, and it was published anonymously in 1795, so right at the height of the Gothic craze. It is very, very characteristic of the Minerva Gothic overall, I would say, in a number of ways that I will talk about. But I want to start out just quickly by listing some of the ways that it's actually unusual, because some of these are the reasons why I chose it. So, first of all, and a few people have already touched on this point, it is very short. It was initially published in just 2 volumes, and the modern edition is only 124 pages long. I know that everybody who teaches the Gothic probably, like I do, struggles with the syllabus problem where you want to put all these really important Gothic novels on there, and they're all 500 pages long and you just don't know where to fit them. So this one is very easy to fit onto a syllabus, especially when you just can't fit another Radcliffe on there anywhere. Secondly, unlike many Minerva novels, it is available in a modern edition from Valancourt Books, and I have my copy here. You can see how very thin it is, 124 pages. So we know that more and more Minerva novels are becoming available through modern editions all the time, but most of them still are not. And so you have to read them either in a library or through Echo or something like that. So especially if you're thinking about teaching, I feel like a book that is available in a nice, inexpensive paperback edition can make that a little bit easier. So we know that Count Roderick's Castle was fairly popular. It went into more than one edition and had an American edition as well. It was also reviewed in multiple critical outlets at the time that it was published. And of course, there were many other Minerva novels that this is true for, but I would say it's more the exception than the rule. When I was tracking Minerva reviews, many, many Minerva novels by the 90s, by the second half of the 1790s, did not receive any reviews in the major large reviews, whereas Count Roderick's Castle did, which gives us a helpful window into what people originally thought of it. Mostly the reviews were quite positive, although there were some critiques, which I can't really disagree with entirely. Then finally, the book is very fast paced. Again, there are other Minerva novels that are fast paced, but there are plenty that I think we might say unfold at a slower pace, a pace that especially modern students find to be extremely slow. So Count Roderick's Castle is very, very action packed. There are probably very few pages in the entire thing where something really dramatic does not happen. So, on that note, I will pivot to the ways in which this book is very representative of the Minerva Gothic. So, first of all, it has all the classic agreements of a Gothic novel and all of those satirical, recipe for a Gothic novel or satirical summaries of Gothic novels. All of those ingredients listed there, you will find here, even though the book is short. You will find castles, mansions, dungeons, murders, kidnappings, evil uncles, usurpers, love affairs, disguises, chains, all of these things you will find. The main plot of the novel, hypothetically, is political. It's all about the joint efforts of a bunch of young people to overthrow a usurper who has been falsely holding the throne of the kingdom for some years. But the actual page-to-page action of the novel is much more focused on the personal tribulations and imprisonments and disguises of all of the individual characters who are involved in this kind of attempted retaking of the throne. The second way that it is quite characteristic is in its emphasis on classic Gothic interiors. There's lots of Gothic novels that have castle in the name, but this one, even more than many, has castles and ruined mansions and similar kinds of buildings just on almost every page throughout the plot. There's a little bit of running around through dark forests, but there is much, much more running around through dark hallways, ruined stairwells, dark dungeons, hidden passages, and things like this. So this, I feel like, is characteristic of the Gothic overall, but also makes this a nice entry point for discussion with students into the importance of Gothic interiors and the way that all of those interiors play into the psychological suspense of Gothic novels and the kind of tension and uncertainty and confusion that a really dark, dreamlike interior can foster in a novel. And I will say, when I read this, a lot of the descriptions of interiors are so intense that I kind of lose my way in the novel as I'm reading them, as I'm trying to picture going upstairs, going downstairs, going into the vault, going out of the vault. I just lose my way in my mental image of the castle. And this may partially be a flaw in the writing, but I also think it's kind of conveying that darkness and confusion and bewilderment that the Gothic interior is supposed to invoke. Then, closely relating to this, another way that I find this to be very characteristic of the Minerva Gothic is the way that it is packed with absolutely ludicrous and bonkers plot points. And I say this with love. I do not think it is unfair to the Minerva Gothic to point out that it often depends on truly incredible coincidences, irrational behaviors by everyone, and just bizarre, out of the blue occurrences. So I say this in a purely complimentary with purely complimentary intent, because I, like many Minerva readers, I think, really enjoy this style and find it extremely entertaining. There's an infinite number of examples that I could probably choose, but just to give you a flavor of one that happens very early in the book, in fact, within the first 14 pages, so I don't think it can count as a spoiler. Within the first 14 pages of this novel, the hero, who we have met, is wandering around in a dark abandoned castle that he coincidentally found in a forest. He meets a stranger within the stretch of maybe one page. He meets a stranger, he murders him, and then he makes the decision very quickly to put on the stranger's clothes and rub the stranger's blood all over his face as a disguise. And all of this is treated as extremely normal behavior by the other characters and by the narrator. So I think that just gives you a flavor of what goes on in this novel. Everybody disguises themselves repeatedly in different guises. Characters you think were long dead turn out to be alive. Lightning hits buildings in just the right place to free a prisoner. Things like this go on constantly. So then this brings me to my final point, the way it is characteristic of many Minerva Gothic novels. I do think this novel certainly has flaws. It appears to have been quite hastily written. And one clue for that is that sometimes the characters are called by the wrong names. There's a whole chapter where one character is just called by a different name just for that one chapter, and then it goes back. Sometimes for reasons like this, it can be a little bit confusing. There's a moral message at the end that is quite muddled. It's hard to understand how that moral message squares with all the events of the plot. All of this, I think, is really characteristic of many, many Minerva novels. And so why I'm closing with this is not to sort of make fun of this novel, although I do think there are certainly places where we could poke fun at it if we wanted to. But I think it raises for me some really interesting questions that link to why I am interested in the Minerva Press in the first place. And one of those questions really is, how do we, or how should we as literary scholars, think about works that are flawed or that are unoriginal or that are for any other reason hard to defend on purely aesthetic grounds? Because I'm very interested in thinking about critical methods that put more weight on attributes like popularity or readerly pleasure or the way books function to develop communities of readers. And I think that novels like this one can help us to think more about how those models of criticism would work. So to sum up, I think this novel is extremely entertaining. It's a very quick read, and I would recommend it because I do think it can help us to open up more of these scholarly and also pedagogical conversations in our classrooms about the Gothic and about the history of popular fiction.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I mean, what's not to love with that description, really? And I think you're right. It raises so many important questions about how we read and why we read, and the kind of question of literary value and what does that actually mean. So thank you so much for that, Hannah. Um, our next speaker is Elizabeth Neiman, who is an associate professor in English and also the director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at the University of Maine. Her research interests include British Romanticism, the history of the novel, feminist theory, and questions concerning humanism and its alternatives. Her first book, which I also highly, highly recommend, Minerva's Gothics, The Politics and Poetics of Romantic Exchange from 1785 to 1820, was published in 2019, and it puts the works of popular Romantic era novelists back into conversation with canonical writers, from William Wordsworth to Mary Wollstonecraft to Percy Shelley. And she's currently working on a new book project called Romantic Longings and the Novel, 1782 to 1861, Sensing Imagination's Limits. So over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you everybody so far. I just have been really excited about the conversations and see a lot of intersections with my own. And in particular, I want to pick up on some of the things that Hannah was just suggesting, and this kind of broader question of why the Minerva? Why do we look at the Minerva? So I'm going to take you back through a little bit of a sort of a mental roadmap for myself in terms of why I'm focusing today in this discussion. I'm going to highlight one particular novel that I did not discuss in Minerva's Gothics called Laurentia it was published pseudonymously by Sabina in 1790. And I'm also going to touch again on a novel that was very central in that book called What Has Been, published in 1801. And that in my work with a co-editor, Jonathan Sadow, we really have been able to, and he really did the biographical, the research, and he found that this novel really can be very convincingly attributed to Eliza Kirkham Matthews, which was a really exciting discovery that he made on his end. And that novel actually is now published with Routledge. So if you're interested in obtaining a copy, it is available, which is really, I think, exciting because it makes for both a very classic, but also, I think, distinctive Minerva novel, which I'll talk a little bit about today as well. So I love the questions that Hannah posed. And, and when I was thinking about how I wanted to start today, I did want to return to this question of why read Minerva novels? And also in relation, why is it that we not only read literature, which we know, of course, was defined as a very distinctive form in the Romantic period, which is when the Minerva novel is published, but also, I think a pressing question for today in this kind of moment with AI is, why be an English major or minor? Why study why go into graduate studies in English? How do we discuss what we do and its value? In the time period that the Minerva published, I think that these questions become especially crucial because, of course, this is where we see the birth of the modern ideas about literature. And in thinking about these two novels that I want to discuss today, Laurentia and What Has Been, I think we also wrestle with the question of what does it mean to be a romantic writer, which is very closely related to what does it mean to read literature and why. Okay, so to go back through this mental roadmap, I want to just first note that after I published the book on Minerva's Gothics, I did come across, well, it was actually towards the end of my research on that novel. It did not show up in my book, but I did read the novel Laurentia, published in 1790. And it really struck me at the time because my mother had recently died of cancer, and it had been a very unexpected illness and death. And I just was reeling with that. And I was at my family home not long after she died. I spent actually a fair chunk of the summer there with my young daughter. And I was reading this novel, and it really spoke to me because the novel Laurentia is focused on this character, as you would imagine, named Laurentia, although she is not actually the storyteller. The story is conveyed through another protagonist, a much younger woman, her niece, named Eglantine, and it's conveyed through letters, so it's an epistolary novel. And the novel, though, really showcases Laurentia's grief. She had lost her lover, and she has never been the same since. She actually descended into madness for some years, we learn about, and she, ever since she kind of came back to, has been living basically a very isolated life and has been in deep mourning. And when her niece arrives, who she actually is recently orphaned herself, and she arrives at her aunt's home, she relays her story that Laurentia actually tells her. She relays it to her friend, her correspondent. And what struck me in reading it was, at the time, I felt like this palpable sense of grief coming through the novel. And, it did really remind me of an observation that I had had when my mom was very ill, and which was that I really could identify for the first time with all of these heroines, who are at a parent's deathbed. And I have to say, some years later, I did reread Laurentia a couple years later, and I did not have exactly the same reaction. It felt I could still see why I had responded that way in that moment, but there also was, what you would expect in these novels of the period, which is that there's also a lot that felt kind of heavy-handed, or back to what Hannah was saying, clunky, or, the kind of things that jolt you from your reading. So I recognized that, some of my experience here was reflecting my particular moment. That said, the novel I thought was very interesting, given the intense emphasis on grief relayed through another woman. And I just didn't have a place in this book. So, I did, but that reading of that book it was part of what informed my early research on this new book project called Romantic Longing, where I was interested in the ways in which longing itself, like in various ways, like how it may shape and impact the literary experiments in this time period, in particular by women writers. And I was very interested, in particular, drawing from my work with Minerva's Gothics on just how central conventions are to those experiments. I really felt like, in the book Minerva's Gothics, I made the argument that Minerva novels draw from this borrowed material, these popular conventions, and that they do so in ways that often introduce new elements to those conventions than that which is generally recognized by literary scholarship, by literary history. And, I suggested there was an interchange with canonical writers, although it was very unequal, uneven for sure. So with that idea in mind, I really wanted to continue. I felt like even though the second book project was going to be focusing primarily on some of the best known women writers of this period, like Anne Radcliffe, Jane Austen, Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley, I wanted to draw from this rich sort of reading of all of these conventions, and to think about how that might impact my sense of where the innovation was, where the experiment was, where we might be able to cite longing and vision, which vision connects with this romantic idea. So to pause here for a moment, in the midst of this period, I'd read Terry Castle's spectralization of the other about the Mysteries of Udolpho. So there's a lot of connection here with the Mysteries of Udolpho. This essay also spoke to me because Castle makes the brilliant argument that in the Mysteries of Udolpho, which so many critics up till her day, she was writing this in the late 80s, those who even focused on the Mysteries of Udolpho at all really just highlighted the supernatural, the emphasis on the supernatural, and just really dismissed most of the larger novel. And Castle's brilliant argument was that there is this haunting element throughout, and that it really is, most of the novel is a sentimental novel. That there's this haunting, Emily loses her father, her mother, but her father in particular, and this grief haunts her. It's present throughout the novel. And through the powers of her imagination, she envisions like the supernatural in her mind's eye. Her father comes before her as if in her mind's eye, and lends her some solace in her time of grief and allows her to move forward. This spoke to me at the time. I thought, because Castle's argument really is that Radcliffe is picking up on a structure of feeling in the moment, a need to express, articulate in a new way grief, and that she captures the tension of this not only British but European audience in a time where people moral codes for mourning and grief are changing in a rapidly industrializing society. And she just captures this felt need for a different way of grief and mourning. And I thought, and she says that this shapes the days to come. It impacts the sort of emphasis on the romantic visionary I and on the spectralized other, on a world where the other within becomes more vivid and real even than like our empirical interactions with others. What struck me, though, most was this idea of the solace that comes from envisioning the beloved in one's mind's eye, because I felt like I had done that with my mother. I was very interested in Castle's argument as I continued to do research, as I got interested in the ways in which romantic texts are often associated with empathy, with being able to reach others across space and time. We think about what is romantic. That's one of the elements, I think, with Wordsworth. And also thinking about why literature can be prized, the idea of being able to step into someone else's experiences, recognize what another feels. But as I did more and more research and thinking, and I was influenced as well by critical race studies and in particular, some reflections on the limits of empathy, as a mode of projection, as drawing the writer kind of more to their own experiences, to sort of, and really at the stake of the thing itself that's being discussed or the person. What's the emphasis but the writer's own suffering and sorrow? So all this is to say is that I think Castle's argument, as brilliant as it is, she's so interested in looking ahead to projection that she's not reading as much sideways. She highlights, by sideways, I mean in the moment, all of these Gothic novels that are published in the time. And, I think she's absolutely right that Radcliffe captures this feeling of grief and that Emily is expressing this grief. And this projection, started to wonder, need it lead to necessarily a sort of transposing of one's own feelings on another? Like, what else might the specter do or enable? In the novel Laurentia, okay, so to now step back to this novel, which I had reread again after reading. Bridget mentioned Bernie Cecilia. Bernie Cecilia, published in 1782, I think evokes much more than her first novel, Evelina, the sentimental framework that Radcliffe herself draws on. That novel is just rich with people noticing and observing other people's blushes, sighs, just the physical exteriority of somebody indicates their interiority. And in the world of Cecilia, the protagonist, Cecilia, is not sure how to read her lover. She's constantly looking at him, analyzing him, and she just doesn't know what to make of his responses and behavior because it doesn't square with kind of what she starts to feel. She had thought he loved her, but then it starts to seem like maybe he doesn't, and she's so perplexed. And her agony, her inner world, her psychology becomes like the focus and the narrative kind of pull of the novel. Evelina is called the sentimental novel, but it doesn't have the same degree of like physicality. There is a moment in Cecilia where Cecilia herself is thinking of her lover, her absent lover, and trying not to think of him. And then all of a sudden he appears before her and she thinks he's a specter. And this is in 1782. Well, it's actually Delville himself. It's not a specter. She's not projecting. He arrives, he's there. And this kind of moves forward the narrative action as it kind of brings forward a different phase in their relationship where they're interacting. And I don't want to go too far into the weeds here with Cecilia, but I thought that this was such a fascinating moment of maybe the possibility of a specter taking a different direction than projection. In Laurentia in 1790, a Minerva novel, an early Minerva novel, this emphasis on the sentimental frame is so present. We have Laurentia being listened to by her niece, Eglantine. Laurentia tells a story of, her grief. And in the novel, Eglantine sees Laurentia disappears from time to time. She's going to this cottage where we learn that Laurentia believes she sees a specter. She literally sees like her dead lover is there. And she is so ecstatic. He's back. He's there. Well, it turns out it's her butler in disguise, trying to fool her for his own reasons. And it's not her lover, the specter, and I just thought this was fascinating. This novel precedes the Mysteries of Udolpho. Um, Laurentia dies of her grief. She does not spectralize. She cannot find solace. But we have Eglantine, the heroine, who listens and tells the story and actually seems to gain some solace from it and is able to kind of move on in her own life as well. Remember, she's an orphan as well. And I just want to map in this book maybe this alternative, this way in which the specter, the projection, the vision is still maybe present because I think it signifies a sort of longing for something that's not there. But maybe that doesn't lead to empathetic projection. Maybe leads somewhere else. What has been a novel published in 1801 fascinated me in my first in Minerva's Gothics because it really emphasizes this meta question of like, what does it mean to write? What does it mean to be a Minerva novelist? That novel too is includes spectralization, but it's like rushed and not really important. It's sort of set aside. So I think it's another novel that post Radcliffe, post Udolpho, maybe isn't as interested in that projection as, later writers could be, Wordsworth could be, and so could potentially, again, help us kind of have this roadmap to a different way of thinking about why literature matters. Maybe it allows us to be moved, but not to feel that we are the other. So I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I mean, I love that idea and I love the kind of emphasis on the affect and what we kind of feel when we read, because I think oftentimes when we talk about literature, the feelings that come about, particularly when we talk about reading genre fiction, right? It's shame. Like, oh, my students say to me all the time, like, oh, I really like crime fiction, or, and I'm like, well, what? That's great. I love that you love crime fiction. Let's talk about why you love it. So I think it's fantastic to think about all the different emotions that we might associate with reading as well. So thanks so much for that, Elizabeth. And our last speaker today is Sean O'Rourke, who is currently lecturing at the University of Limerick and has written on the intersections of the Gothic and contemporary societal challenges in venues such as the Irish University Review, as well as the upcoming My Wild Heart Bleeds and Global Vampires edited collections. Sean also regularly disseminates his research in public-facing arenas, such as the Lefanu Video Symposium he organized, RTE Brainstorm, and the Irish Film Institute. And Sean, your slides are showing, so I'm going to hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Tina. So the Minerva novel I'm recommending is The Mysterious Hand or Subterranean Horrors, emphasis on the exclamation point, written by Augustus Jacob Crandolph. And I'm going to start by saying something that might not help my case about why you should actually read it. It's something other people on the panel have kind of touched on, but with some of their novels, I think I'm going to say it more explicitly with this one. It's maybe not good, at least not like conventionally. And Hannah said she wouldn't make fun of her novel. I won't make that promise with mine. The novel charts the love story of the noble Theodore and the angelic ingenue Julia, as well as the various ways in which the villainous Count Egfried disrupts their seemingly fated union. And he does so through attempting to seduce Julia on a hot air balloon. He strands Julia on an island rigged with enough explosives to blow up the island itself. He traps Theodore in a cavern where Theodore is seduced by a murderess, as demonstrated in actually kind of eloquent passages musing on her like plump arm and delicate feet. Maybe the author kind of giving away a little bit more there than he intended. Basically, the novel is off the chart silly and bizarre. Now, and this is something we've talked about today, scholars like our own Tina Morin have argued that we should show that non-canonical works matter and have value through things like showing that they were influential. I can't really say that that's necessarily the case for this novel. Crandolph, like many of the Minerva novels, we don't know that much about him. Caspar Winterman has argued that Crandolph might be a misspelling of the author's name altogether. He doesn't seem to have written, or we don't know about anything else he's written. The novel has been found in some private libraries, and there was a French translation, but I haven't really found any evidence that it's the kind of forgotten popular favorite that other Minerva novels might have been. So might not have been influential, and it's not very good. But I think that its badness, what we might consider its badness, actually makes it really interesting, worth studying, and above all, quite fun to read. So early in the story, we have this really grumpy narrator who states, if any of the characters I describe shall appear uncommon, the incident incredible, or the situations romantic, let not me be blamed. Nature, in the innumerable movements of her admirable mechanism, occasionally produces events that are unaccountable. So the narrator here presents the novel we're reading as a real event that he's recorded, a really popular tactic in Gothic fiction. But this novel goes a bit further in that its narrator frequently makes statements like this to justify what we could perceive as bad writing. And I'm pretty sure I received advice in like first level creative writing classes not to do this sort of thing. But it's the contrast between these ostensibly ridiculous events with these consistent assertions that all of this is true, which I think kind of draws attention to and forces us to contemplate the limits of believability and verisimilitude. In moments where I start to write off this novel, when I start to not being able to take it seriously at all, these justifications from the narrator constantly force me to justify my own judgments about believability. Then complicating this whole believability issue further is a key moment where the narrator effectively tells us that he lacks access to the mind of his characters. So when he's rendering a villain's overtly villainous inner monologue, the narrator reveals that he's actually kind of making some guesses. So he states, quote, "What? It is probable he thought. Do I love only myself and hate or despise the whole world besides, all to no end?" So the narrator tells us that he is at least sometimes guessing rather than stating facts in this supposedly real story he claims to be relating faithfully. So this could be a hint from our author that this narrator is unreliable. This narrator maybe doesn't actually have the knowledge to write this story, and maybe that's why it's all so ridiculous. But the text itself maybe kind of provides a challenge to some conceptions of unreliability, such as Wayne C. Booth's influential discussion of unreliable narration. Booth argued, quote, "In the irony with which we are concerned, the speaker is himself the butt of the ironic point. The author and reader are secretly in collusion behind the speaker's back, agreeing upon the standard by which he is found wanting." Now, many literary theorists since have kind of disagreed with this sort of author-centric notion of unreliability. Crandolph actually kind of prefigures this criticism by making us unable to make really any conclusions about some intended irony. The issue here is that the shakiness of some of the writing and characterization, more so than any kind of death of the author literary theory, sort of makes me unsure how much to believe I am colluding with the author against the narrator. Indeed, the line between bad writing and unreliable narration is blurred. The badness of the text itself kind of unmoors us from normative abilities to judge what is reliable or not. And this might be kind of a stretch, but it sort of made me think of the kind of quixotic real world battle we all go through daily to find, quote unquote, reliable sources of information, an issue that's become all the more pronounced in recent years in our own world, with increased discussions of fake news alongside the compounding issue that much national and international politics has seemed kind of more silly and ridiculous than, quote unquote, realistic lately. In this novel, through the narrator saying ridiculous events are true alongside his indeterminate reliability, in this text, we're similarly stuck in intersecting questions about reliability and believability, all in a world where the ridiculous very well might be an everyday reality. So its simultaneous badness and insistence on realism can this sort of prompt an in-depth conversation about what narrative believability means and how that concept relates to our experience of our world. Also, and I don't know how academic it is for me to say this, but the text badness is just really charming. So James McDowell and Richard McCullough, in a discussion of movies that are deemed so bad they're good, points out that the enjoyment of bad movies can't just really be chalked up to Schadenfreude, because aficionados of these so bad it's good movies often show real affection for such works. And I think this novel's kind of flagrant thwarting of, good writing practices produces a similar effect, giving me real affection for an enjoyment that I wouldn't have gotten in a more straightforwardly competent work. And it's maybe that enjoyable badness that functions, with apologies to Mary Poppins, as the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine of very serious social commentary to go down. So, for example, this novel has a quite serious debate about the death penalty. We have the protagonist Theodore who's put on trial, and he argues in a very, very long segment of the novel that the jury should acquit him, even if they think he's guilty, because acquitting enough people would force the laws to change. So Theodore basically kind of early jury nullification king. But this anti-death penalty argument is kind of in conflict with other events and voices in the story. The text also depicts moments where antagonists are captured and spared only to escape and kill many, many more people before being later killed by the mechanics of the plot. Further, the narrator, when describing a man who Theodore kills in self-defense, says that his death was, quote, a fate he had long deserved. So the position of the text on the death penalty becomes perhaps clouded a bit. To come to any conclusion about what the text is saying, we need to dig into its details, confronting a variety of seemingly opposed positions to fully conclude what the text is actually trying to tell us. And I'm open to the idea that all this confusion may be due to thoughtlessness or bad writing. But again, the effect of that badness is to prompt us towards contemplation and to place narrative authority on us. So, to put it plainly, this novel is charmingly bad. But its badness actually calls us to exercise our intellectual faculties, considering moral and aesthetic questions with a considerable amount of agency. So its badness is like the best so bad it's good movies, kind of part of its appeal, and I hope that is appealing at all for any of you who might be considering reading it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. And again, it kind of gets me back to what Elizabeth was saying there. We often when we think of the kind of distinction between genre fiction and literary fiction, it's like, well, literary fiction makes you think and you have to work for it, and genre fiction doesn't. But in fact, I think what you've shown there and what many of our panelists today have shown, that actually these novels really do ask us to think quite profoundly, and about really profound questions as well. So thank you so much for that. And I have not read The Mysterious Hand, but I will now go search it out as charmingly bad. So thank you very much. There is already one question in the chat. We have just over 15 minutes for discussion. So Mateus Silveira, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, is asking Hannah, and anybody else who wants to comment as well. I found what you said about the supposed problems of plot disjunction, etc., very interesting. Less as a flaw in bad writing and more as a procedure that creates a somewhat dreamlike atmosphere of confusion. Could you comment a little bit more on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I loved the part of Sean's paper just now where you mentioned that this sort of the question of bad writing sometimes makes it impossible to tell whether you are looking at bad writing or you're looking at unreliable narration. And for us as critics, it makes it sort of difficult to tell where one might end and the other one might begin, which just unmoors everything that we're trying to do analytically in a really interesting way. I think I'm seeing something similar in Count Roderick's Castle in terms of the confusingness of the interiors, because I think in a Gothic novel especially, any Gothic novel almost, I feel like there is usually some element of confusion for the character, where the character is running around, through a dark forest or in a dark cave or in a dark building, and they lose their way and they're not sure if they are going the right way to get out, or, they're not sure if they've already passed this doorway before. And so I think what really was striking to me in this novel, is that because there is this unusually high level of detail to the interiors, they're really telling you, like, you're going up this many steps, you're going through a door, you're going down these other steps. This room was above that room, but below this other room. You just absolutely can't keep up with it. And so I think I could not say whether I think that's just bad writing and the author thought that their reader would be able to fully envision what they were describing, or whether that is an attempt to replicate this sort of dreamlike confusion. And there are places where the characters revisit a place and they've been there before, but they don't realize they've been there before. And you, as the reader, start to say, wait a minute, how many dark mansions can there be in this forest? And so I think, like, my instinct is that it's somewhere in the middle, and it is deliberate, and it is designed to kind of give you that same unmoored, are you on a journey, or are you in a sort of recursive circle of visiting the same places over and over again that the characters are experiencing? And because of that instability with the writing, you just never can be sure what is the intent and what is the effect. And then I see Matt has answered in the chat also, but yeah, a lot of Minerva novels were circulated in the US. Like, I couldn't give you a number offhand, but there were lots and lots of them. And sometimes they were kind of under a different name, or, assigned to somebody different. Sometimes they have illustrations in the American version that they don't in the British version, but they were clearly quite popular.
Yeah, I can second that. As Matt mentions, I've been doing a little bit of research on this, and partially because William Lane himself was so entrepreneurial. We know that he was kind of forging these connections and these relationships with American printers, and he, I think, was really invested in the spread and dissemination of the novels that he was publishing, whether or not, as we know, the authors themselves were kind of benefiting from that. But yeah, the Minerva novels, as Hannah suggested, are kind of all over the early American Republic, in super interesting ways, I think. I think there was one more question in that first comment. Hang on, let me just find it here. Um, Many critics consider many passages of Poe's novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, flawed as well, when in fact they seem much more like ways of presenting reality itself as illogical and dreamlike, and of problematizing the possibilities of a plausible representation by a first-person narrator. Do you think this could be a sophistication of these novels, or simply flaws and carelessness in writing? And maybe, Sean, that might be something for you to come in on.
Sure, yeah. So in this novel specifically, I truly don't think there's any way of knowing really, especially because we have no access, or at least there seems to at this point be no access to Crandolph himself as the author. What I will say is that the novel gives a lot of characterization to its narrator. He is constantly complaining about how he feels like he's going to die. Writing is awful for him. He's just struggling to get these chapters down. He makes a repeated reference to how much he's struggling just to write the thing. So any of us who have to write things, which is all of us, I think that's like intensely relatable, that you feel like you want to die a lot of times while you're writing. So one of the things I was reading about with So Bad It's Good movies is that one of the things people have affection for are the creators themselves. The creator of the Room, which is one of the like big So Bad It's Good movies. People have affection for its creator, Tommy Wiseau. And this novel actually kind of simulates that by giving us this quite weird narrator's voice. And so I think the weirdness, whether it was intended or not, gives us this kind of affection for a narrator who maybe isn't that good at writing, seems to be close to death, hates writing this thing he's chosen to do, which again, intensely relatable. And it creates this interesting kind of empathy, I suppose, and this unique kind of charm that whether it was intended or not is the effect. So I don't think it's possible to draw a line there, or at least not a clear line, but we can enjoy that sort of that sort of tension that's created there between bad writing and unreliability.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Anybody else want to jump in? Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that we tend to, provide more sort of like grace in our readings to the canonical, right? And so in terms of what critics are more willing to overlook or even like embrace in texts by writers that we know, and often like when we know their biography as well, it helps us kind of parse out something. I think that is certainly an element here. So, I like to think about that as well. I think Yael Shapira's work on Isabella Kelly really highlights this as she finds more and more research. She does more and more research on Kelly. She's able to really explore how elements in the novel that may just simply seem like bad, overused kind of tropes are actually for Kelly opening up a different avenue for critique, in particular of marriage.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. Um, there's another question in the chat from Deborah Russell who says, thanks for the great talks, everyone. A question for Beth. I've seen Oakendale Abbey sometimes attributed to Anthony Carlyle. Is there any clear evidence either way on that front? And might the attribution, real or not, tell us anything about the medical Gothic subgenre?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's something I did intend to mention, but in the interest of time, I kind of cut it out. It's something I've addressed in my unpublished work as well. So that attribution has to go to Don Shelton, who originally has made this claim about Anthony Carlyle. So for context, he is a surgeon and anatomist at Westminster Hospital. So he made this claim, which really provoked my interest in the novel in itself. It's not only that this has got a medical Gothic kind of context to it, but also the potential of a medical author. It's intriguing, and I think going down them rabbit holes of the mythology around some of these authors, and I think it's been mentioned in a lot of papers. It's like it's really addictive and something that you can kind of get lost in with the Minerva Press. You just this idea there's these little tidbits of information that come up in these novels, and then you just go down these rabbit holes of like who actually is this author. For better or for worse, sometimes it leads you to something productive, other times it can lead you to actually, does it matter who this person was? Let's just look at the novel itself and think about Minerva Press. For me, it was entirely productive. Whether you can't go either way in terms, I do not think we'll find any conclusive evidence to suggest that Anthony Carlyle was Mrs. Carver. I think it's a great theory. I think we can play a lot around with that as well. And I certainly played around a lot with these ideas. His interests, the things that he would be interested in terms of the status of anatomy at the time, the public fears of anatomy at the time, as the problem of body snatching. So body snatching arising because there is no legal supply of bodies for anatomy at the time. Medical practitioners during the rise of anatomy at this moment are saying, anatomy is so important for the progress of medicine, and yet we have to rely on these kind of criminal means. So I've thought a lot about in this novel whether if he was writing this, it's not necessarily that he's highlighting, oh, look how horrible and scary anatomy is, but actually look at the problem of that it's body snatchers that are the problem, and we need to come out and stop the illicit sides of anatomy and actually find legislation that will make anatomy kind of above board, for example. So I put that in the context of a lot of political debates around legislation at the time that was happening. So regardless of whether he's the author or not, I think it's reflective of conversations that are being had between Gothic and medical writers at the time. The other part that it takes me down the route of is actually it highlights someone who was being overlooked in the Godwin and Shelley circle as well. So he has clear relationships with people like Mary Wollstonecraft and Godwin, and was around during Mary Shelley's upbringing. So again, there's a figure here who has these mysterious links to people who also, Hannah, for example, shows us and draws attention to the fact that Godwin potentially wrote the Minerva novel Imogen. So he has links to Minerva Press that takes us back to Anthony Carlyle as someone who was in the household at the time. And again, it just strengthens those links of a medical Gothic novel because again, we can start linking that to Shelley, who's later writing Frankenstein. So it does take you down a lot of different avenues and kind of just solidifies those links of medicine and Gothic and how often the kind of the blurring of fact and fiction. And just it's just fun, isn't it? The idea of authorial play in these Minervan texts, it's just something that can kind of draws you in and just can take you down productive avenues of thought, regardless of whether it's true or not.
Yeah,
Long
thanks, Beth. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking of Catherine Cuthbertson's novel, *The Romance of the Pyrenees* from 1803, which has a lot of similarities. I think it's not a Minerva novel, but as Jenny Batchelor has shown, Cuthbertson was publishing in the Ladies' Magazine, and then there were connections. Anyway, so and I think in terms of that kind of chronology you talk about, it's really interesting. There's another question here from Rowan Harrison. Thanks, everyone. This has been wonderful. I wonder if any of the panel has spent time with the novels attributed to Mr. Nicholson, aka author of The Village of Martindale. These span from pretty good to charmingly bad and quite weird. It strikes me that they characterize an aspect of Lane's earlier period as if there's an effort to trial many genres and styles in the hope that something clicks. So thanks for that question, Rowan. Anybody want to take that? I mean, I think Deborah McLeod's work has been really influential in showing that, like, particularly in that early period, Lane was really experimenting, and that in fact his lists as a whole are much more diverse than we generally tend to think. They're not just Gothic, and as some of our panelists have already mentioned, right, like there's a lot of sentimental fiction. There's much more of a mix. And when you look at Deborah McLeod's thesis or her work, I mean, it's magisterial in many ways because it just shows that diversity. Um, so yeah, I mean, I can't comment specifically on Nicholson's work. I don't know if anybody would like to comment on that.
I can't comment on it directly, but
Yeah.
I just did a search through my computer because there's so many ones that I might have read, 10 years ago or something that I was
Yeah.
trying to see. And I got one hit. And actually, Elizabeth, this hit is out of one of your articles, and it's in a quote from the Follies of St. James Street. So this is not a direct answer to the question, but it did call my attention to the fact that in the scene in Folly of St. James Street, where there's a young lady who's coming in to talk to the publisher, who is William Lane as a character, and trying to seek out publication. The um, the narrator says, this work is now presented to the shrine of public favor, and it possesses fully the mechanism of other books, James Wallace, which is one of Robert Bage's books, I believe, Village of Martindale, The Welsh Heiress, The Duke of Exeter, and others. So um, it is very interesting that if you're right in the speculation that all of this author's books are kind of in a different style, clearly this is a moment where William Lane is trying to list to list Village of Martindale among these other sort of books that he's using to advertise himself and saying like these are the examples of the best that I have to offer. So that's kind of a fun little detail.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Thanks so much. We have one more question in the chat, and it's something that I kind of dovetails with something that I wanted to ask specifically Bridget about. So I'm going to kind of put them together if that's okay. And I mean, I'm just so fascinated and encouraged and enthused by the fact that you're teaching Minerva Press novels and that you're getting a good response from the students. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your methods in the class. You talked about the Google Docs that you were keeping lists of the names. I remember reading Tom Jones for the first time as an undergraduate and like literally having a sheet at the front of the novel where I was like, okay, this person is also this person, you know? So I mean, I just think it's fantastic. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And this, as I say, there's a kind of linked question in the chat. With so much excellent research into the Minerva Press and its publications published in the last 10 years, where would you like to see Minerva Press research go in the next 10 years? So over to you, Bridget.
Awesome. Yeah. So I mean, I definitely think that there's a lot of value pedagogically in studying these texts, right? And like I said, I found it so fascinating just how much my students latched on to thinking about these novels in relation to the contemporary publishing industry, right? We spent so much time like comparing this novel, The Abbey of Clugny, to like the infinitely derivative versions of the like a blank of blank and blank novels, like the that are following, A Court of Thorns and Roses and like iterating on that, right? And my students really, really latched onto that. And because I think they're so interested there's this renewed interest in the legitimacy of genre fiction and the way that, students are on book talk and, social media, and thinking about I mean, the way that a lot of these Minerva novels like emphasize the tropiness of fiction, you see that in so many texts today, right? Like literally like an enemies to lovers romance or whatever, right? And so I think it is really productive. Um, to kind of take that as the starting point, right? These are not easy novels to read or to study. We did, have to use the echo text of the Abbey of Clugny and, having to have students orient themselves around reading the long S and, all of that. But I think that they found so much value in doing this project because it felt like they were doing something new. And, to tell my students, like, very few people even know who this person is. Very few people, if any, right now, today, have read this novel. Like, you are contributing something of value. And they did such good research. So, talking about some of the methods that I used and the tools, we used the platform of Omeka to share our research. So, that was at the stage that they were researching, they had to create like little entries. I was seeing if I could maybe try to pull it up, but I don't have the website off the top of my head. But they had to create entries for each of their pieces of research that they found, where they summarize what it is, how it contributes to the research that we were doing. Once we started working on the introduction, we split up into three separate groups. So I had one group that was just researching the Minerva Press, one group that was researching Meek's biography, and then another group that was researching French history, because that was so integral to the novel. And so that was kind of the research that they were finding. But yeah, it went really, really well, like
Yeah.
so surprisingly well. I will say, once I actually had to do the edits for the edition, I had to do a lot of work on my end.
Yeah.
That, these are undergraduate students.
Yeah.
They're not
Yeah.
the greatest fact checkers. But they did such great work
Yeah.
on the front end that I don't think I could have ever done if I was editing this edition on my own.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that that would be a really cool direction for some of this scholarship to go, to think towards, how these novels in particular are kind of very interestingly set up for our pedagogy, right?
Yeah.
I always say to my students, like, I love messy, bad novels, like the messier the better, because they reveal so much about how fiction works, right? And I think that that's really teachable. So,
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I also, I mean, I am struck as well by the kind of enduring or the durability of Minerva novels, right? We talk a lot about, oh, um, the tropiness, right, as you said. But as you also mentioned, right, what we see in a lot of romantasy fiction now is a kind of recycling of those tropes in
right.
often very self-conscious ways, I think. So I think
Mhm.
there's something super interesting happening. And I think it would be really interesting to see more research on that connection. And also just to see, I think, generally more I mean, yeah, we have done a lot of work in the past 10 years, but there's like we're talking over 1,000 works that Minerva Press published, right? So there's a lot more work to be done. So research, research, research. I think we're all super enthusiastic, at least I am now, leaving this session about my reading list, about the Minerva novels I'm going to go back to and reread. And I hope everybody who's come along this evening feels the same or is energized to go read Minerva novels if they haven't already. I'm conscious of the time. I know some people are in the middle of their days. So I just want to say huge, huge thanks to all of the panelists this evening for such a fantastic discussion. Thanks to Matt for really kind of, helping me come up with this idea. And thanks to Rosalind for all the help getting information out to everybody. So thanks for joining us this evening, and let's go read some Minerva novels. Thanks, everyone.